This happened when I was a freshman in college. I photograph concerts on the weekends, and they usually end at around 11 or 12 at night. This night in particular, I was planning to meet up with a girl named Kim, who I had a class with. I finished up at the concert and went to a McDonald's to get a snack and a drink while I waited. Kim lived kind of far away, so it took her around 25 minutes to get there. We met at the parking lot, and she got into my car. I definitely didn't see a long-term relationship with this girl, but she was cool to talk to and hang out with. We sort of just drove around. By this time it was about midnight. Also, we weren't in the nicest part of town. This was kind of the outskirts of our downtown. Being young and dumb, we parked in a shady neighborhood that was almost all dark. We started to kiss a bit, but then decided to get into the back seat. At the time, I drove a Ford mid-sized SUV with limited tint. Even though we were in the dark, we would be noticed in the car. After a couple minutes of kissing, and admittedly shedding some clothes, Kim screamed. I didn't know what it was about, but I found out soon enough. We both looked out the front windshield, and there stood a man. He was too dark to see any features, but he was definitely staring straight at us. He also had his one arm pointed towards us. It was definitely hard to see much, but we both swore he was holding a gun and pointing it at us. I immediately jumped into the front seat with my pants partially off. I turned the car back on, and we took off fast. The man seemed so creepy. We assumed he was either homeless, or maybe on drugs, or maybe he was just looking to harm us. Even though we were both scared, we knew that the threat was out of reach once we drove a bit. We definitely should not have been in that neighborhood, and I was also so unaware of my surroundings at the time. I could only imagine how bad it could have been. Needless to say, we were both spooked, and we were thankful that we made it away. We ended up still hanging out for a bit, and then called it a night. It definitely made me think twice about doing something like that again, and being more cautious for my safety, at night especially. I'm 43 years old now, but this happened a long time ago. I was 10 or 11 years old, and I was visiting my grandparents. They lived on the outskirts of a pretty small town in northwestern Oregon. They had a beautiful old house surrounded by tall trees. Neighbors were few and far away. It was always peaceful out there, and I loved spending time with my grandparents. It was a real change from my ordinary life, because I grew up in a small townhouse with my mom. I was an only child though, so there was always enough space. One evening, we were driving back home from spending the day out. We had gone to a state park to do some hiking. It was an hour-and-a-half drive there, much of which was on a pretty remote road. The sun was setting, casting a beautiful orange glow over the countryside. We were driving down a dirt road, the only vehicle on that road. It was bumpy, but it was always fun to feel the car jump up and down. Up ahead, we saw a fallen tree blocking the road. My grandfather stopped the car and got out. He walked over to the tree to see if we could get around it. I remember feeling a little nervous as I watched him disappear behind the tree. After a few moments, he rushed back to the car. He jumped in and frantically started it. My grandmother and I looked at him, startled. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing. I know a shortcut," my grandfather said. We drove away quickly, the car bouncing up and down on the road. I knew something was wrong. I could sense it, but I didn't know why. I looked back to the fallen tree, and I couldn't see anything in the fading light. We made it home safely that night, and the incident soon faded from my memory. It seemed pretty insignificant at the time. Years went by, and I'd almost completely forgotten about it. One day, when I was in my early 20s, my grandfather finally told me the full story. He said that when he got out of the car to check the fallen tree, he heard rustling in the bushes nearby. He thought it might be an animal, but he saw several men approaching. They were all dressed in dark clothes, and a few of them had guns. He said there were at least 4 of them. My grandfather knew we were in danger, and he quickly got back into the car and turned around. He drove away as fast as he could, not stopping until we were back in town. He was really scared, but he didn't want to worry me, so he kept it hidden. Thinking back on it, I could sense something was off, but I never knew why until my grandfather told me what really happened. He kept his composure and may have saved our lives. He definitely saved me from a really traumatic experience. Whether it was life or death, I'm not sure. He's always been my hero, and this is one of the reasons that I saw him that way. We never found out who those men were, or why they were there, but he knew that they were up to no good. He told me that he reported it to the police the next day, but never heard anything back. We figured they cut down the tree to block the road so they could rob anyone who stopped to look around. Why they didn't block it from the other side, I have no idea. Maybe they were new to the whole crime thing and still working out the scam. I don't know how that stuff works. This happened a couple years ago when I was out on a shoot. I do a bit of photo work on the side. I was planning to shoot portraits for a client of mine named Dante, who I had worked for before. He was pretty nice and he was around my age. I often got payment after, but it was not uncommon to get paid prior to a shoot. He had sent me the Cash App that morning and gave me a little extra to pick him up at his house. I didn't really mind, considering he paid extra, and it was near the shoot location that I was planning. In the early morning, I went to pick him up. He lived in a pretty decent neighborhood, and I waited a bit for him to come out. We began driving. He immediately told me that he needed to pick something up somewhere, and that we needed to make a stop. I wasn't super excited about that, since he already paid me, and the photos were for him. We didn't need anything else, but he insisted, and I reluctantly agreed. He led me into a bit of a shady area. He told me to pull into an apartment complex, and I knew it wasn't a good place to be. There were a lot of cars, but there was one spot open, so I parked there. I assumed he would go in alone, but again he wanted me to come with. I definitely didn't want to, but he said we could take some photos inside the apartment, and it would be a quick stop. I reluctantly got out and grabbed my camera. Conveniently, the apartment was right in front of the parking spot that we were in. It was on the second level, so Dante knocked. We were greeted by 3 young men who were around our age, late teens to early 20s. They were all wearing red and looked a bit intimidating. For reference, I'm not a big guy, and I'm not really capable of defending myself with my hands. I was immediately very uncomfortable. Also, the apartment was really gross and dark. There was only one couch, and not much else. There was dirt and ash on the floors from smoking without an ashtray. We walked in, and even though I got some looks, they seemed somewhat nice. I took some photos of Dante on the couch, but it really wasn't much of what I wanted. I then turned again to the other 3 and noticed something. All 3 had guns in their hands, and they were standing in a circle. They were counting through some money, and I overheard that they had just robbed someone earlier. I definitely got more worried after that. I texted my girlfriend at the time and sent her my location. I told her not to come, but just so that she would know where I was. I told her I would text her soon. I wanted to get going, and conveniently, it appeared like they were going out as well. The 3 were talking about how they were planning to rob another person that evening. I instantly remember that my car was right outside, and I wondered if they would ask me for a ride. I absolutely didn't want to drive them and be a getaway driver. As we inched down the stairs, I hoped that Dante wouldn't bring up my car. We got closer, and that was my time to make an exit. I told Dante I needed to get going, and surprisingly, he didn't bring up the car at all. I said goodbye to the group. I immediately got into my car and locked the doors. I didn't want to leave right away, because they were walking towards the exit. I waited a minute and then started driving. I passed them walking on the road, but thankfully they didn't see me. I was so thankful to be out of that uncomfortable situation. I did end up sending edited photos to Dante, even though there weren't many. I told myself I wouldn't shoot him again. Thankfully, I haven't seen any of them since, and I'm glad things went in my favor that day. Things could have been much worse. Back in 2005, my wife Sarah and I were on our way to a getaway in the mountains. We had been looking forward to it for a long time, and we were excited to finally have some alone time. There was a cabin that we had booked for the weekend, and we were also planning to do a hiking trip afterwards. This incident happened before any of that, though. We were driving late at night because we both had to work during the day, and we wanted to get as much driving done as possible. As we were driving down the dark, winding road, we saw a car in the ditch on the side. It was just off the shoulder. It wasn't flipped or anything. In fact, it was not immediately obvious that there was any damage to the car at all. It was summer, and the weather was clear, so bad conditions couldn't have caused it. Sarah and I looked at each other, and we knew we had to stop and help. We pulled over to the side of the road and got out of the car. We left our headlights on, because without them, we would be lost in the darkness. As I approached the car, I could see that the front door was open. I called out to see if anyone was inside, but there was no response. I cautiously walked closer to the car and peered inside. It was empty, and there was no sign of a driver or any passengers. I looked closer at the car, and I could tell that there was no serious damage. I walked around it for a minute and noticed skid marks on the road leading up to it, but no flat tires or anything. I thought that maybe the brakes failed, but I wasn't sure. I walked closer to the open door at the front of the car. That's when I noticed a trail of blood on the ground leading away from it. It led through a field, and there was a forested area beyond that. I called out to Sarah, and she came over running. We both knew we needed to call the police right away, so we did. As we waited for the police to arrive, we tried to piece together what might have happened. We speculated that the driver might have been injured and stumbled away from the car in search of help, but that idea was full of holes. Why would anyone search for help in the middle of a field? Waiting in the car would make much more sense. It also didn't explain the fact that the car showed no damage. If there was no crash, then where did the blood come from? Neither of us had the answers. When the police arrived, we explained what we had seen and showed them the trail of blood. They immediately began to search the area. It was dark though, and they didn't find anything at first. My wife and I stayed at a motel nearby for the night. It was too late, and we were too freaked out to drive anymore. The next day, we were going to continue our trip. We thought that the police had the situation under control, and we could forget about it. That's when we got a call from the police. It turned out that a body had been found, but the details made no sense. It was a young man, around 25 years old. He was found more than 2 miles away from the car, in the woods. He had 2 gunshot wounds to the abdomen. How he made it that far away from the car, in that condition, I can't explain. We still have no idea why he wandered into the woods, or if he was dragged there. If so, by who? We were out there not long after it all happened. It still scares me to think that we may have been watched by whoever shot that poor guy. No arrests were ever made, and the case went cold. It's believed to be a random act of violence, with no motive. In situations like that, it can be near impossible to nail down a suspect. Needless to say, Sarah and I couldn't go on our vacation. It just didn't feel right. I was on my way to visit my brother at his new house. It was the first time I'd been to his new place, and I was looking forward to catching up with him and seeing his new home. He had moved out to the countryside, and although I was not very familiar with the area, I had printed out the directions and thought I'd be able to find my way without a problem. This was before GPS and smartphones. Those of you around my age will remember MapQuest, and that's what I was using. As I drove, I followed the directions as best I could, but I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere because I found myself on a deserted country road. The road was narrow and winding, with no signs of civilization in sight. The only thing I could see were fields of corn and wheat stretching out for as far as the eye could see. I kept driving, hoping I would come across a landmark or a sign that would get me back on track, but the road seemed to go on, with no end in sight. I began to feel anxious and frustrated, and I was angry at myself for getting so lost. I knew I could find my way back if I turned around, but I was still hoping I could get there without backtracking too much. That's when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. There was something off to the side of the road. It was a car pulled over to the shoulder. On a whim, I decided to stop and ask for help. I pulled my car to the side of the road, directly behind it. I got out, and as soon as my feet touched the ground, I saw blood on the dirt next to the cars. It was fresh, and when I noticed that, I really freaked out. I jumped back into my car and started driving away. However, a nagging feeling in my gut made me stop. What if someone was hurt or in danger? I couldn't just leave without investigating further. I turned around and drove back, and then I got out of my car once again. I cautiously walked towards the cars, trying not to make any noise. As I got closer, I saw that the blood was coming from a man lying on the ground next to one of the cars. He was unconscious, and his face was covered with bruises. I turned around and jumped back into my car. I sped back in the direction that I came from. I knew there was a gas station several miles back, because I remembered seeing the sign. When I got there, I told one of the workers what happened, and that we needed the police. It turned out that the man was the victim of a robbery gone wrong. He and his friend had been driving down the road, and they were ambushed. His friend managed to escape, but the man I saw was beaten and left for dead. The thieves took off, and as far as I know, they were never caught. I never found out why the friend didn't call the police. Some friend